Hello, Internet, and thank you very much for tuning into this YouTube channel. My name is Simon Safdar, your host for this show, Cloud Native Podcast and Cloud Native FM, our Twitter handle. So, what we're covering today, I will give you the some quick glimpses of what the agenda we have for you today. So, we know there's a lot of debate around open source communities. How do we value our works? We get paid out for it. So today's topic around we're doing how we build a Patreon for the open source ecosystem, a platform where open source maintainer can grow, build their communities, nurture their communities without being the mercy of the algorithms, and the platform where the open source ecosystem seamlessly integrate and the community grows and the customer be able to consume your services, and that benefit and that all these benefit is really a delightful experience for them. So it's going to be a very important session we're having today, and I invited guests who are doing some incredible work in this ecosystem, and I should be calling out Birk Birk Jernström from Polar.sh. Over to you, Birk, and give us your quick intro about where you are and some of your background story.
Yeah, absolutely. So first, thank you so much, Saim, for having me on today. So my name is Birk. I'm based here in Stockholm, Sweden. And I started this company called Polar.sh, which is, as Saim mentioned, it's a platform for open source and indie developers with the mission of getting you paid to focus on your passion, whether that's building an open source library or building, your independent company as well. And our tagline is that we want to help you from the first donation, even to the point of an IPO in the future. Obviously, that's a few decades away. But what we mean by that is that we want to build a platform that helps you get validation for your ideas and your passion, getting members to help fund your work, and for our platform to help scale alongside your needs, to help offer SaaS and products and digital services and everything in between. So yeah, that's in short what we're building, and we're building Polar open source as well. And I know I'm about soon to give a demo. So yeah, excited to do that and showcase what Polar has to offer today.
Yes, absolutely. I'm looking forward to some of the wonderful demos you prepared today. But before first, we see a lot of the community. There's a debate around like open source is not just a hobby. It's now turned out the side gig with nothing in return. And we see a lot of confusion in the open source communities. And there are very few solutions that can solve the purpose of the open source maintainers. So without you giving you the demo, I want to learn from you one step further before we go live and check everything. So what motivated you to focus on the open source funding challenges?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. So I think there are a few things. First, what you should know about me is that I'm a self-taught developer since I was a very young kid. And I make that statement because my entire career has been in the IT sector and building websites and web services. And that would not have been possible had it not been for open source, because I'm self-taught, and the way that I learned was through devouring open source libraries and code that existed to gradually become a better engineer. So ever since my first Hello World, open source has always been extremely near and dear to my heart. And I absolutely love the ecosystem and what it powers for our entire industry, as well as for the education side of it as well, helping others to learn and become better engineers. Then separately, I have a background. I started a company called Tictail that was an e-commerce platform before this that was acquired by Shopify back in 2018. And so I worked in e-commerce for 10 years with the mission of basically empowering independent entrepreneurs to start their own businesses and become successful in that, but obviously selling more physical goods. And so when I quit 2 years ago, I think these two passions sort of like the middle of that Venn diagram became polar, right? Loving open source and engineering as a background, but how do you empower those individuals to actually be able to focus on their passions and be able to pursue that full time? That was a problem statement that I was immensely excited about. And so I've been going down this rabbit hole ever since.
Awesome, absolutely. And I love the way you actually came out with some of the initiative, because these are the cornerstone where we see a lot of the debates and challenges, because we want our work to get valued for, because a lot of the open source maintainer put a lot of the energy, and they have some families and the kids, and they have to support them as well. And I can see some wonderful initiative that the Polar came out, and it's a very research oriented project. It's not just you pick up the coding and start doing it. When I see a demos out of it, I see it's a very research oriented work as well.
Yeah.
So before I late, I want you to give some glimpses of it, so
Yeah.
I can ask you to share your screen, and hopefully people can now your screen.
Yeah.
Yes, I can see perfectly well. So over to you. Give us some quick glimpses of what you are offering today.
Yeah, awesome. So here's Polar in terms of our open source GitHub repository. I want to show you this just because I want to mention that Polar is an official funding provider together with GitHub. So you can easily add your Polar organization on GitHub. Shows up really, really beautifully like this. You can click in on this, and then you're taken to your Polar page, your public Polar page for the rest of the world to see. So this is the official one for Polar itself, where you can see the amount of subscribers we have, you can donate, you can see our newsletters that are like our public posts. And for Polar, that's about it, but I prepared a little bit of a demo here. So if we jump over to this demo account, you have the same thing, right? So you have the information about the organization, donation capabilities, like this public newsletter. But here I've also highlighted like subscription tiers, sort of this membership program, where we have these built-in benefits that are designed for the developer ecosystem. And it's things like premium posts tied to our newsletters, automatic Discord invites, but also access to private GitHub repositories, file downloads that are like SHA-256 checksum throughout the entire flow. So we're taking everything that we're seeing the open source community and indie developers that they're typically upselling, and we're building that natively built into Polar to make it super seamless and effective for you to do. But again, this is your public page. If you go in as a maintainer, this is what your dashboard looks like. So you have an overview with some steps you can take. You can check your newsletters. You can write a post. So let's do that. Just one quick highlight is that it's really nice that this is GitHub flavored Markdown. So you can do things like this. Let's do like JavaScript. I'm just going to do a super simple example since we don't have that much time. And you can write things, and then you can do like subscribe now as a component in there. If I preview this, we automatically generate this from, again, the GitHub flavored Markdown. And the beauty of this is also that we take care of the enormous headache of doing this so that it's email compliant as well. You can basically just click publish, send it to your subscribers over an email. Do you want to send it to all your subscribers, including free subscribers, or to premium subscribers? And this is where our open source roots come into play, right? So it's a challenge for open source developers. They're writing content, but they want that content to be distributed to everyone. So this is a really nice balance where you can say it's premium, but maybe it's just our early access. So a few weeks from now, it's going to open up for everyone. So you can subscribe to get early access, but then later on, it's open for everyone. You have products in here, so you can easily create both subscriptions on a monthly or annual basis. And this is where you can, toggle on the different benefits that we have built in that you can easily set up. Set a one-time price instead if it should be a product. You can check your like sales and donations and get like really good insights on how you're performing and how things are going. And then one other thing that I want to show, and we can spend a little bit of time here because this is a feature that we're very known for, is issue funding. So as I mentioned, our tagline or our motto is sort of like helping you go from the first donation to an IPO. So donations and issue funding is really key to us in the beginning. So here I have a cloud native demo repository that I've connected to my GitHub organization. So let's go ahead and create one. Let's do like this. How are you today? You can imagine this is a real issue. And so that's created for the repository. If I go back here, you can see that automatically and in real time, we get that in from GitHub. And me as a maintainer, then imagine you have a bunch of different feature requests or like bugs and all of the things that we see in open source, right? If there's like features that are more aspirational as part of the product and the roadmap, like imagine now that I can say, I would actually love to get support and help my community to help fund this specific effort. So you can just click on badging this, as we call it, which automatically, if you go back to this repository, updates that issue and embeds this badge, where your community, they can see this issue. If they're interested in it, they click on it, and it's this very seamless integrated experience into GitHub, where you as a maintainer are in complete control. So it's not issue bounties that anyone can post on your behalf without your control. And here, as a community member, I can fund it immediately. I can fund it once it's completed, set the amount, and so forth. So let's just say we funded $20 here. I can also set like funding goals tied to this so that it showed how much do I want to get. I can set rewards, which means if I get, say, $500 for this, if there's contributors in my existing ecosystem that help solve this issue, I want to share it 50-50. I could even say 100% goes to contributors. It's completely up to you. If I go back now, let's see here. So now we see, here we go. For this issue that we just created, $20 was funded. And I can keep track of this. And if we have time, I can even show you how, like, the full flow if someone does a pull request and so forth. Do we have time?
Yes, yes, absolutely, definitely. Go ahead.
Okay, cool. So let's do this. So imagine now that we're in this repository where we created this issue. So now we're other people besides the two of us. And I see this and I'm like, yep, so this is a little bug on GitHub side where they don't show the dark mode initially, but here we have the badge. So I'm just going to switch now to, where do we have a switch account? Here we go. To this test account that I have. I believe I already have a fork, but let's say I want to fix this bug. Yes, I have a fork. So creator. Here we go. And just to make things easy, let's just do it like this. Fix, fix, fix. You can imagine, you're coding away, you're fixing this actual feature now in your own fork. Then you're going to contribute it upstream. And before I do this, I'm just going to quickly check it was number 9. So I'm going to say like this fixes number 9. So this is, the typical GitHub workflow, right? And you can write more stuff in here as you typically would. You create that pull request. Now, obviously, if I switch back to my real account here and I go to this one, I can merge this and I see this as a pull request. But now also if I go back here soon, sometimes this takes a little bit of time, or the demo god's not with us today. Interesting today. Huh. Okay. So demo gods are not on our side now because we get webhooks from GitHub and we update everything in real time. Specifically in terms of contributions, there's no webhooks for that. So we do some clever polling from time to time. So that's why we're not seeing this instantaneously here. And we can sit and wait a little bit, but within 5 minutes or so, it's going to pop up here that someone has made a pull request. If you merge that and close it out on your side, then you can easily just click, because you set up a reward 100%, then you can easily automatically distribute that to that contributor on GitHub. So it's a bit shame that the polling wasn't timed in the right way here. But the idea is obviously that this is super seamless and integrated into GitHub. And with just a few delays here and there, it's a very, very intuitive workflow where you can, as a maintainer, say, these are the issues that I hope my community can help crowdfund. And then you can distribute rewards amongst that funding across your contributors as well. So yeah, in summary, there's a lot in here, but we offer like donations, issue funding, the ability to sell products and subscriptions with really native developer first benefits, and a markdown first with GitHub flavored newsletter that you can offer as a benefit for your subscribers as well. So this enables everything from, just donations and issue funding, if that's where you want to start out, which a lot of people do, to gradually growing, right? Where you can start offering like a newsletter, and then you can offer subscriptions as sponsorware, and then you can graduate to selling like pure products and integrate our API with OAuth to basically unlock membership benefits or services directly within your cloud products or cloud services, whatever it is. And that's how we're going to help get you from first funding to hopefully an IPO 10 or 15 years from now.
Awesome, awesome, absolutely. So we will wait, because you mentioned like it takes might be 5 minutes to actually pull the data out. So while this is happening, so
Yeah.
as I'm while it is happening, I can ask few questions from my open by wearing a developer or open source maintainer hat, because this sound very resonating that what I mentioned earlier. When you look at the Polar, you see is a very research oriented project. You see what the community needs, and when you log into the Polar and start doing the work, it can easily incorporate into the software development life cycle. So
Yeah.
now there are a few things into it. Like as an individual maintainer, let's say, so if you talk about just me, as Simon, I am an individual maintainer and I have a repository. Let's say I'll build a time library
Yeah.
for, let's say, my project, and then I open up in the GitHub repository. Let's say if I add something in my repository, like be a Patreon for my pagers, you can use this library in your production environment.
Yeah.
So what is, like, I can understand the flow. Like for the individual perspective, can you give us few details on the just for the individual perspective, we're writing a repository and they wanted to give some funding back.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think, as I mentioned, Polar, in your words, Polar is a little bit like research oriented. And I think it's fair that obviously this is not a solved problem by a long shot. And so there's a lot of hypotheses that we have and a lot of things that we're experimenting with in terms of how we can help drive more funding into this ecosystem. But a really guiding principle, or what like helped us define how we're focusing at Polar, is rather than looking so much at the problem, because that's everywhere, like almost all open source developers out there are getting like zero in funding. It was rather to look at who are the ones that are successful. So you have people like Caleb Porcio or Martin Donath out there that are making a lot through GitHub sponsors today. And the shared truth amongst all of them that are driving a lot of funding is that they figured out this inflection point of how can I offer like as much as humanly possible as open source, but then what are the value add benefits that I'm also giving that I think every open source developer is, but for that I'm actually charging a premium. And so for Caleb and Martin Donath, they do sponsorware. So you have like a private repository where you can access like cutting edge development and new features that are eventually pushed upstream to the completely free open source repository as well. And so like my recommendation for like the individual is really to just like start with donations and sponsorship. That's great, and when they happen it's fantastic, but to be mindful of and to dare like experiment a little bit with what are the things that I'm doing for free. I'm answering a ton of issues and support questions coming in. There's a bunch of feature requests coming in that I'm developing over the weekends. And so start by adding issue funding on those features so that you can get support and get funding and set a goal for your weekend hackathon, so to speak. And then gradually grow from there into offering like a membership program with more sponsorware or sponsorship type benefits. Because the more value that you can sort of gatekeep a little bit, you're going to see a lot higher conversion. And I think in the community, there's a lot of people who would want to fund more, but it's just hard for us humans, right? If it's completely free, you don't get anything for it.
Yes,
Unfortunately, most people won't do it. That's just a fact.
absolutely, 100%. I think we have 5 minute marks. Can you check like is the demo were completed?
Yeah.
uh Absolutely. And I think
So it seems what I can do here. So I think maybe I mistake the reference that I did on issue here. Something.
Yes.
What we'll do instead is just as the maintainer. Let's say I merge this. There we go. If I go back here, so show closed. So here we have this one. I can mark it as completed here, and this is where like the polling didn't work in this specific case, but like in most cases, it always does fairly quickly. But you would automatically have like the Polar creator, which was my GitHub test account, show up here as the person that I should give 100% to, since that was the reward I set. But I can
Yes.
also just set like Polar creator here. Okay, I don't know what's demo is not on my side today here, but you
No worries.
specify the user, you click confirm, and they get a notification that they can sign up, and then they get that funding as well. And then obviously you can split this. So like you as a maintainer get 50%, 70%. It's completely up to you, and you as a maintainer are fully in control. And then if I go
Absolutely.
into finance here, we built everything so that we have our own internal ledger, like we're the merchant of record. And so we offer you this seamless way of keeping track of, like I have $18 in this test account right now from these different types of transactions. I can withdraw it whenever I want to do that. And that can be withdrawn to Open Collective or to a Stripe Express account that you connect.
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why I'm saying like it's a very detailed, and as you mentioned, there's a lot of hypothesis went into these strategies, like what fit the most of the use cases as well. So I believe we have. Thank you very much for showing some of the demos, and if we
Of
have
course.
missed something, we actually keep an eye out on the Polity YouTube channel as well, because that's have some great information into it as well. So I
Yeah.
linked some of the talks on that. Yes, that's the demo. I think there are some demos you already did on this YouTube channel, and I think
We'll
hope there
do a
are
lot
more.
more as well.
Yes, a lot more coming up as well.
Yeah.
But great, thank you very much for sharing some detail into it as well. So
Of course.
before I leave, absolutely, before I leave you, there are, as you mentioned, like there are some wonderful hypotheses went into it as well. Number one, I see the benefit of you don't have newsletter setting, because I, as a content creator, have to pull up some subscription model of $100, $50 just to put emails flowing into the my viewers account, and they see
Yeah.
what I'm going on a daily basis. So with Polar, that's already embedded in it. I think that's I love this functionality
Yes.
of being uh,
Yeah.
and as an individual contributor, as you mentioned, like you have to slowly and gradually mainstream some of the features. So your early on pay Patreon subscribers can see what the latest edge was, and then eventually land into the upstream projects where everybody can able to see. For the individual, I can touch bases on so many different things. Like I can create some courses on the Patreon that's only the paid subscriber can see it, and
Yeah.
then I eventually want some pieces of it for the public. I can do it. So there are endless capabilities and the transformation we can get from this activity. So
Yeah.
keeping up the team, let's say I have a CN, let we have some project either on the Linux Foundation or the CNCF spectrum. So as a community, we have some issues flowing through. So with Polar, can you share some tips on how we can articulate full open source development in a team setting with using some of the capabilities Polar brings in today?
Yeah, absolutely. So we do have like our origin is very much focused on, the independent open source developer and indie developer. But having said that, we definitely have like some companies and some organizations that are using Polar, like everything from pure open source organizations like Serenity OS and Ladybird, which we're immensely excited about and big fans of. So they're using it together with like multiple maintainers, right? And it's sort of the same approach, right? Where for an organization, typically they use Polar initially for like rewards and issue funding. So they might have solved in parts the problem of funding, where they're getting more and more funding from, say, businesses. But now they want to help distribute that funding and pay like individual contributors that are helping out with their efforts. And Polar has been really great for them in those use cases because it's seamless for them to just say, on this issue, like we're offering $500 or we're offering crowdfunding for it. You're in complete control there. But it doesn't stop there, right? Like I think what Polar is building is sort of like the mix of Patreon and like a lemon squeezy or a paddle in that sense for the developer ecosystem. So you have the membership model, and for a lot of these organizations, that can make sense as well, where you can offer like newsletters in terms of updates, and those can be entirely free, where you share those updates with everyone, and like you can offer some gradual paid for benefits like private Discord server invites, where you might get some enhanced support, for instance, with some additional SLAs. So you can like really take it as commercial as you want, or as free open source as you would want as well. And I think that's the beauty, right? Where regardless of your use case, you can sort of cherry pick to make Polar fit with your story.
Yes, absolutely. And I think like I can conclude some of the conversation here as well, because in the community right now, what I feel in the open source community happening, sometimes you don't have expert in your team, and a lot of the contribution has been made solely on the different places without actually you paying something. So you're giving some hoodies or some bags or some batches to the open source maintainer, so you get value for their work as well. So what usually find, people find some expert in their team who are doing some open source evangelism in the community, in the organizations. But with Polar, you can actually skip this part, because now we actually have an issue funding with the project. So this will eliminate a lot of the stuff you actually articulated for the evangelism now. So you can actually outreach an issue, then
Yeah,
people will look at the issues and they see more benefit. Now I get rewarded $50, $200,
yeah,
$2,000. Let's put more money into it. So now you have not just the student or the open source maintainer or the hobbyist people, even commercial or the people who are very proficient with their career, who have spent a lot of time into it, they can bring more attention into this work as well. I That's why I'm saying,
yeah,
like, this all the work their team is doing is pretty much on the hypothesis and the research being flowing through, because it's very difficult how you get
yeah,
rewarded for the open source, because there are so much into it. And I
yeah,
could imagine we live in the world where we have endless possibilities flowing into the Polar, and then people will get actually customize based on their settings, based on their needs, what went into the Polar, and how you get actually based a reward based ecosystem in the Polar based Patreon for open source communities. So some of
yeah,
the conclusion I can make, and then I definitely want you to summarize all the things we described, because I know there's a lot we can cover in the
yeah,
detail as well. But I can summarize. We have some. You have newsletter for the individual subscriber. You have the Patreons for the individual people who can actually add repository, the private repository, the Discord channel. I think people who are get used to the Patreon, they understand how the flow work.
yeah,
But with Patreon to the open source communities, you can fund based, issue based funding for the different project as well. And
yeah,
now I want you to spend few times on the team. I know there's some team featured in the Polar as well, and leave us with some of the roadmap currently in the
yeah,
Polar,
yeah,
and that's the high level what's went flowing through in there as well. So over to you, give us some insight into these two spectrum.
yeah. So I think there's two sides of teams here. So one is, like teams using Polar for their open source efforts, and then teams like companies, say, that would want to subscribe or fund open source effort that they depend on. So quickly on like teams for open source organizations, like you alluded to this, but I'm incredibly excited because we are integrating so deeply with GitHub, and we get these webhooks and signals. And I think we're just at the starting phase in terms of how we can leverage that. So, they have the Patreon model with these subscriptions with memberships. Like you could pay for that to get access to those benefits. But I'm really excited about the opportunity of how you as a maintainer can set up, if you're a contributor that contributes, regularly, like automatically you're going to be like get free access to this premium tier where you get a bunch of those benefits that are otherwise paid for. And that's a way to, automate like merchandise and t-shirts and file downloads, Discord invites, like special newsletters, all of these benefits that you can reward contributors in a seamless way with those as well. On the other side then, so you have companies depending on open source. I would say this is the area where I would agree with you most, that Polar has been very research oriented. And so the fact is that we actually built a lot of features that I didn't show today that are completely hidden behind feature flags. Features like an organization can sign up to Polar and set an organization-wide budget for team members that are invited to their Polar account, so that team members across a company could have a budget to subscribe and pay for open source efforts, to fund issues and so forth. We have that feature. There's some polishing to be able to make it like generally available. But I will say, I think this is the most controversial part probably, because in open source, there's always this mantra that like companies should fund for open source. And intellectually, I agree with it. But the reality is that I don't think it's going to just happen overnight, even with more seamless tooling. Because I've spoken to hundreds of different companies, and where the rubber basically hits the road is that you need to be selling them something that they can measure and like understand what is the return on investment in order for them to unlock serious capital and not just, basically charity. And so I think that's why we're doubling down first and foremost on like, how do we equip you as a developer and maintainer with the superpowers to really unlock like those commercial capabilities and start demanding or requiring or making it seamless for companies to have to pay a specific subscription in order to get private Discord access to certain SLAs, or to be able to, have certain feature requests or all these benefits that you want to set up. Because I think that is fundamentally what needs to change in order to significantly change the culture of how companies will eventually fund open source. That became a very long, so feel free to shoot back some questions if there's something you feel I need to dive into a little bit further.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I think you nailed it perfectly, because a lot of the people who might listening to this podcast, they feel like now we learned the Polar and this is super research oriented, and a lot of the hypothesis went into this project. But if we look at the company's perspective, it's sometimes very difficult for the companies to understand which project to fund in. What I
Yeah,
see usually in the companies, they build something as an open source, and then they build a ladder on commercial offering that all of the rest of the people use, and we paid for them. And then they think
yeah,
like how this Polar can help. Eventually, they see a lot of the benefit for the open source onboarding model, where this is a very difficult task. Like you bring in more developer from a lot of the different places, and you don't giving them any reward, and then you later find out there's one person is for doing some incredible job. Let's give them a talk on some of the conferences. Let's give them some hoodies, give them some badges. Now with Polar, they can initially initiate some of the more rewarding that can be more attracting for the open source developer. So onboarding become very easy for the open source communities. So I think
yeah,
that's a really shining piece. But as you mentioned, as you talk to a lot of the different companies, the next piece where they build out a model, they fund back to the open source communities, that's quite to be a tricky one. But I'm
yeah,
really happy and I'm very hopeful in the future that this stuff is going on. As companies see more value being added into the feature set, they can understand, oh, in this organization where we're working on, we have this workflow. Can we
yeah,
extend Polar to do these kind of stuff? So that possibility can happen. It easily can happen. And also, I think before I let you go, I do notice here that you have some sort of React SDKs and some
yeah,
other front end SDKs, so people
yeah,
can put some code into it and make that available in their website. So I before we move, before we
yeah,
conclude the conversation, I believe
yeah,
it's a very handy feature. Can you give some glimpses why you have added this, and
Yeah.
have what your experience of being customers are using in it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of want to, on the topic of companies as well, just address that as well. But I think these two things can be merged into one. Um, so starting with our React or TypeScript SDK and our API, we are going to announce Polar version 1.0 in the next month or two, by the end of the summer. And the big thing that we're working on right now is just really like making our API shine and our SDKs shine, with the strategy that you should be able to take all of Polar's capabilities and seamlessly integrate them, like almost near white label. That's not going to happen in the next few months, but over the course of multiple months, into your docs, sites, or services. Because for open source maintainers, like for popular libraries, it's an insane amount of traffic that they typically get to their docs. Like that is such a compelling billboard and conversion point for them. And so we want to offer seamless capabilities for them to like offer donations directly through their docs, offer like issue funding and like highlighting that within their docs, or even all of these subscriptions and products that they might host through Polar as well. To even leveraging our API, right, to build, and we're working with some companies and some bigger open source maintainers on how we can power their cloud services on top of their open source libraries, where we handle like VAT, sales tax, and the billing, and integrate all of this seamlessly into their GitHub repository and all of that good stuff. So that's basically the strategy behind the API, for us to focus on the boring stuff and just like building really innovative monetization and funding um, Lego pieces that you can put together to make fit your own model, whether that's through Polar and the public page that we give you, that's beautiful out of the box, or integrate it as deeply as possible and build like a full-fledged SaaS service if you would want to. Because that's how I think we can help like truly get you from like the first donation to ultimately like potentially being an open source company that could IPO, right? That would require you to have a large customer base and charge for commercial services on top, whether that's SaaS or one-off products, for instance. So that's the reason why we're focusing on the API. And going back to the company discussion, as I mentioned, we're putting so much emphasis on just being the platform that gives individual open source and indie developers like these superpowers, where they can focus on their passion and where Polar can manage everything else related to getting them paid to do what they love and build amazing stuff. Because I genuinely believe that if more open source developers, and we're starting to see this, I think, experimented with sponsorware, like found the right inflection points where they can commercialize, like required people who just berate them on GitHub issues for feature requests and plus ones like infinitely. Just say, hey, here's a badge. I want $1,000 if I'm going to be able to do this. And just like actively get people to start funding and paying for things. That I think is the key in order to drive more funding and eventually for the business shift to end up happening. Because I think having chatted with so many companies, I think it's a little bit of a cop out in our ecosystem that we like, yeah, it could be hard for companies to understand what they should fund, but is it really that hard? For most companies, you're using Postgres, you're using these like huge open source projects, but you're not funding them. So it's always the story about like these small open source, and it's hard to identify them. But okay, what's the narrative that you're not funding the big ones then, that we rely on heavily all the time? And so I think the truth behind all of that is just the paradox of open source is that it's immensely valuable, but its value lies in commoditizing its own value, like giving it for free. And whenever you give something for free, it's enormously hard to get money for it. And so that's, I think, is the trick of just doing so much more beyond the open source code you've already given that you can actually charge for. And let's start doing that. Because once you do, I guarantee you, engineers within companies will start saying, look, we can get access to like early development on this project, or like premium abilities to upvote on the roadmap, or funding these issues. It becomes an entirely different topic internally then, where they can unlock capital in a much more seamless way, rather than saying, hey, we've used this for 3 years, it would be nice to kind of give back. That's very hard to get up the totem pole in a big organization.
Yes, absolutely, totally agree with you as well. And I think during this notion of, I think if I convert, if you look at a lot of the different companies, the direction is like people are building or purchasing platform in the near future. We
Yeah.
see internal developer platform, internal developer portal. If Polar become a part of that portal, I think this is a very great investment, because now you are actually incorporating your sum of innovation in an open source way, but that's giving you some ROI in return. And
Yeah.
everybody in the
Yeah.
organization can understand like why we are using it. We have to paying them, we have to do this, we have to get some money back, we have some outsourcing some stuff, and the monetization become very easy. And you have a central place where all the companies procedures around open sourcing funding can rely on, and you can actually customize the setting based on your research, based on your customer interaction as well. I think during the time this innovation is happening, the timing is tremendously well. And as I
Yeah.
alluded during the conversation all the time, that when I look at some of the demos of the Polar, I look at, see, now this is not just project by the one person who think about the idea. This is the project who have get into the all of the hypothesis, all of the research material behind it. And when you see this effort has been put into it as well. But Burke,
Thank
I
you.
would love to talk to you more on this topic, because this is a super important topic. And if
Yeah.
you look at the internet, it's quite heavy these days as well, specifically in the open source communities. So what I will do is, when you come up with some launches in the near future, I will
Yeah.
interrupt you again, and then we can give a deep dive on what actually you have landed. Tell us how the organization will use such of the feature as well. But thank you very much. I take it your more time that we have planned for today. Sorry about that. But thank you very
No
much for
worries.
some wonderful and detailed discussion around that. Before I let you go, what is your key takeaways? What are your final thoughts or key takeaways would you like to share with our listeners?
Yeah. Yes. So I would say, as an ecosystem, for the open source ecosystem, we need to celebrate and encourage experimentation and discussions. Or like, let's bring capital into the conversation, and make that like completely normal. And for you as an individual developer, like, I will leave you again with, I think you need to be proactive in terms of getting more funding towards your efforts. Like, GitHub sponsors and Polar and all of these efforts, they're great, but it's always just going to be like one-off and here and there sponsorship and coffee money if it's just like you enable that feature. You need to figure out like how you actively like can start commercializing or making it more prominent that people should fund your efforts on a continuous basis. And that's where Polar really shines. And within our ecosystem, like, I've talked to really well-known developers that are getting a lot of funding from companies that are like, they've achieved the dream, but the reality is that they're sitting there and like, now I'm dependent on one or two companies. And if one of them pulls their contract in terms of their sponsorship, I'm back applying for a job. Like, I'm fully dependent on these two companies now and what they want. And then we have other developers on our platform that like deploy sponsorware as a model, which I'm incredibly bullish by. It doesn't work for everyone, but if it does for you, think about it and actually experiment with it, because we have multiple developers on our platform using sponsorware that are getting like significant money on a monthly basis now, which is really, really awesome. And again, I think it just comes down to like, people want to help support these efforts. People are just, it's hard to depart with your money if you don't feel that you're getting something in addition. That's the challenge here. And so experiment with that. And it can be small things to start with and then gradually grow from there. That's my encouragement to everyone listening.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. I think you actually phrase it from all of the people who are get depressed by this some of the open source ecosystem, and by listening to your talk, they get really understand like there are some potential we can bring into the ecosystem that everybody get rewarded from this ecosystem because what end up happening is a lot of innovation is going into the bigger organization who are using these tooling to build some commercial offering as well. Why not
Yeah.
those developer get paid for what they have contributed because that end up going into the commercial offering. So that's a very very unique way of thinking around the developers angle as well. But I think
Yeah.
there's some innovation happening, especially you have a wonderful team. Michelle Hashimoto from HashiCorp, also the part of the team as well. And I can easily predict in the near future, there are some incredible innovation happening. So end up we becoming a very fall in love with the Polar and its capability for our community in the open source as well. But thank you very
Yeah.
much,
Of
Burke. And
course. Thank
sorry I
you.
taken more your time than we actually planned. But have a
Um,
great debate with you. And we'll be interrupting with you as wanted to learn more about how we actually make some cool funding and cool stuff in the ecosystem. With that, thank you very much for listening to this podcast. Go into the polar.sh on the GitHub repository, github.com/polar source, and go into the website polar.sh, and let's build a Patreon for the open source ecosystem. And hope you'll enjoy the podcast. Keep looking up. Stay safe, stay healthy. We'll meet soon. Bye bye.
Awesome.